If you want to know the exact moment when our quiet Tuesday turned into the kind of mess that makes you wish you'd taken up accounting instead of detection, it was when the doorbell rang at 11:47, and I opened it to find a woman holding a jewelry box like it contained a live scorpion. She was tall, dark-haired, and expensively put together in the way that suggests she'd never had to check a price tag in her life. Her coat was the kind of black wool that probably had its own pedigree, and she wore it with the casual authority of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and having conversations stop. But there was something in her grey eyes that didn't match the rest of the picture, a wariness that made me think she'd been expecting bad news for so long she'd forgotten what good news looked like. "I need to see Nero Wolfe," she said without preamble. Her voice carried the slight rasp that comes from good breeding and better cigarettes. "My name is Elena Pembroke." The name rang a bell, though it took me a moment to place it. Elena Pembroke, as in Pembroke Steel, Pembroke Foundation, and about half the cultural institutions in the city that had marble lobbies and brass plaques. She was what the society pages called one of the last great heiresses, though from what I'd read, she seemed more interested in running her late father's empire than in providing entertainment for gossip columnists. "Mr. Wolfe is in the plant rooms until 1 o'clock, I told her, stepping aside to let her into the hall. "But I'm Archie Goodwin, and I can tell you whether your problem is the kind that gets his attention or the kind that gets you a recommendation to someone who charges less and promises more." She followed me down the hall to the office, moving with the controlled grace of someone who'd learned early that every gesture was being watched and catalogued. When she settled into the red leather chair, she kept the jewelry box in her lap, both hands wrapped around it like she was afraid it might try to escape. "3 days ago," she said, "I returned an engagement ring to the man who gave it to me. Yesterday I was accused of stealing it." I leaned back in my chair and gave her the kind of look that encourages elaboration. That's an interesting progression. Most people who return things don't get accused of keeping them. Most people don't refuse to marry Charles Whitmore. Now that was a name that made the society pages on a regular basis. Charles Whitmore III, old money, older family, and the kind of social connections that could make or break careers with a well-placed word at the right dinner party. He was also, from what I'd heard, about as exciting as watching grass grow in formal wear. "Mr. Whitmore proposed. You said no, and you gave back the ring," I summarized. "So far, this sounds like standard operating procedure. Where does the theft accusation come in?" Elena Pembroke's mouth tightened. "Because the ring I returned wasn't the ring he gave me. According to his mother, anyway. She claims the original stone was a 12-carat pink diamond that belonged to Charles's great-grandmother. What I returned, she says, was a clever fake." "And you say?" "I say that's impossible. I never had the ring appraised, never took it out of its setting, never did anything with it except wear it for exactly 6 weeks before I came to my senses." She opened the jewelry box for the first time since she'd arrived, revealing a ring that caught the office light and threw it back in a way that made my eyes water. "This is what I returned to them yesterday morning. This is what Charles gave me 8 weeks ago. If it's not the same ring, then someone made the switch before it ever got to me." I studied the ring without touching it. I'm no expert on precious stones, but I know enough to tell the difference between something that costs a month's salary and something that costs a year's. This looked like the latter, but then again, so do a lot of good fakes. "Mrs. Whitmore's accusation," I said. "How public has it gotten?" She called the police yesterday afternoon. They were polite but skeptical. Apparently, disputes over engagement rings fall into some sort of legal gray area, especially when the accusation comes after the relationship has ended. Elena's voice carried the kind of controlled anger that suggested she was used to being taken seriously and didn't appreciate the novelty of being dismissed. But she's also been making calls to friends, to board members of organizations where I serve, to people who matter in this city. The story is spreading. "And you want us to prove you didn't steal a ring you voluntarily returned?" I want you to prove that if there was a theft, I wasn't the thief." She leaned forward slightly, and I caught the scent of expensive perfume mixed with something sharper, fear maybe, or just the kind of desperation that comes from watching your reputation get dissected in drawing rooms across Manhattan. "Mr. Goodwin, I've spent 15 years building a life that matters. I run a foundation that feeds thousands of people. I sit on hospital boards, cultural committees, educational trusts. If Eleanor Whitmore succeeds in painting me as a thief who preys on the families foolish enough to welcome her, all of that disappears. Even if you're innocent." Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Especially if I'm innocent. Guilt at least has the virtue of being interesting. Innocence just makes you naive." The sound of Wolfe's elevator descending interrupted whatever response I might have made. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway, moving with the measured deliberation of a man who considered haste a form of vulgarity. He took in Elena Pembroke with a single glance, noted the jewelry box in her hands, and settled into his chair with the air of someone preparing to be disappointed. "Miss Pembroke," he said, his voice carrying the kind of formal courtesy that could mean anything from mild interest to active hostility. "I understand you have a problem involving jewelry." "I have a problem involving justice, Mr. Wolfe. The jewelry is merely the weapon being used against me." Wolfe's eyebrows rose perhaps an eighth of an inch, which for him was equivalent to standing up and applauding. "Indeed. Please proceed." Elena gave him the story in clean, efficient sentences. The proposal, the refusal, the return of the ring, and the subsequent accusation. She didn't embellish, didn't plead, and didn't try to charm him. She simply laid out the facts like evidence in a court case and waited for his verdict. When she finished, Wolfe was silent for nearly a minute, his fingers steepled in front of him, his eyes half closed. Finally, he opened them and fixed his gaze on the jewelry box. "The ring," he said. Elena handed it to me, and I passed it to Wolfe. He opened the box with the kind of care usually reserved for handling unstable explosives, studied the contents for perhaps 30 seconds, and closed it again. "Miss Pembroke," he said, "you are either an exceptionally skilled liar or the victim of a particularly sophisticated deception. I prefer to think of myself as the latter." "As do I." Wolfe set the box on his desk, aligning it precisely with the edge of his blotter. "The ring you have shown me is unquestionably valuable, but it is not a 12-carat pink diamond. It is, unless I am much mistaken, a very fine sapphire of perhaps 8 carats, skillfully cut and beautifully set. The question, therefore, is not whether you stole Mrs. Whitmore's diamond, but rather what happened to it and why you were given a different ring entirely." Elena Pembroke went very still. "You're saying Charles never gave me his great-grandmother's ring?" "I'm saying that unless his great-grandmother had remarkably modern taste in gemstones, the ring you received was not the ring his family claims to be missing." Wolfe leaned back in his chair, and I recognized the expression that crossed his face. It was the look he got when a case stopped being about money and started being about something more interesting. "Miss Pembroke, I believe you have been made the unwitting participant in a deception of considerable complexity. The question is whether you wish to discover the truth, regardless of where it might lead." "I do." "Very well. My fee is $10,000, plus expenses." She didn't blink. "Done." Wolfe nodded to me, and I retrieved the standard contract from the safe. As Elena signed it, Wolfe continued his analysis. "The deception, as I see it, has 3 possible architects. First, Mr. Charles Whitmore himself, who may have substituted the sapphire for the diamond before proposing, intending to retrieve the original stone while appearing to honor his family's traditions. Second, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, who may have orchestrated the substitution to prevent a family heirloom from leaving their possession while maintaining the appearance of generosity. Third, some unknown party who gained access to the original ring and made the substitution for reasons yet to be determined." "And you can determine which?" I can determine the truth, Miss Pembroke. Whether that will satisfy your desire for justice remains to be seen. Wolfe glanced at me. Archie, you will call on the Whitmore family this afternoon. You will speak with Charles, with his mother, and with anyone else who had access to the ring between the time it was removed from whatever vault or safe deposit box it normally occupies, and the time it was placed on Miss Pembroke's finger. You will be charming, persistent, and utterly shameless in your curiosity. My 3 best qualities, I agreed. You will also visit the jeweler who presumably sized or cleaned the ring before the proposal, and you will obtain the name of whatever appraiser Mrs. Whitmore consulted before making her accusation. Elena Pembroke stood, smoothing her coat with hands that were steadier than they'd been when she arrived. Is there anything else you need from me, Mr. Wolfe? Your patience and your assurance that you will take no action in this matter without consulting me first. You have both. After I'd shown her out, I returned to find Wolfe studying the sapphire ring with his magnifying glass. Interesting? I asked. Illuminating, he corrected. This ring was never intended to deceive Archie. It is too fine, too distinctive, too easily identified by anyone with knowledge of gemstones. It was meant to be discovered. Which suggests that Miss Pembroke's refusal of Mr. Whitmore's proposal was not the beginning of this deception, but rather its intended conclusion. Wolfe set down the magnifying glass and looked at me. Someone wanted her to be accused of theft, Archie. The question is why. I had a feeling that before this case was over, we were going to discover that the answer to that question was considerably more complicated and more dangerous than a simple matter of a missing diamond. But then again, with Nero Wolfe, it always was. At 1:30, Fritz served Wolfe cold trout with dill sauce and placed a glass of milk in front of me, which told me everything I needed to know about how my morning's work had been received in the kitchen. The trout was magnificent and didn't deserve to suffer for whatever crime Fritz thought I'd committed, so I applied myself to it with appropriate reverence. We'd gotten as far as Wolfe's 3rd deliberate bite when the doorbell rang. Fritz appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who'd been personally affronted by the concept of interruption, looked at me with eyes that suggested the milk had been a warning rather than a punishment, and waited. I went to the door and opened it to find what could only be described as a social invasion force. 4 people arranged in formation like they were planning to storm a particularly well-defended drawing room. Leading the charge was a woman in her 60s who wore authority like other people wore perfume, liberally and with complete confidence in its effect. Her grey hair was arranged in a style that probably had its own patent, and her pearls could have anchored a yacht. Behind her stood a younger man who looked like he'd been pressed from the same expensive mold, a sharp-nosed individual who screamed lawyer from 50 paces, and a young woman in pale grey who held herself with the careful composure of someone accustomed to watching other people make decisions. Mr. Goodwin, the older woman's voice could have frozen champagne. I am Eleanor Whitmore. We are here to collect property that belongs to our family. Collect? I stepped aside to let them in, because watching Wolfe deal with uninvited guests was always educational. I don't run a pawn shop, Mrs. Whitmore, but you're welcome to come in and see what develops. I led them through the hall to the office, where Wolfe took one look at the procession and set down his fork with the air of a man whose day had just taken a distinctly unpleasant turn. His eyes moved over the 4 visitors with the methodical precision of someone cataloguing invasive species. "Madam," he said to Mrs. Whitmore, "you have invaded my house during my lunch hour. Make it brief." The sharp-nosed man stepped forward. "Mr. Wolfe, I am Avery Kerr, of Kerr and Molyneux. We represent the Whitmore family interests. This is Charles Whitmore," he indicated the younger man, "and Miss Lila Safford, the family secretary. We are here to retrieve a ring that rightfully belongs to the Whitmore estate." "Do you indeed?" Wolfe's gaze moved to the young woman, who met it with steady grey eyes that suggested she was accustomed to being noticed but not necessarily heard. "Miss Safford, you maintain the family's records?" Among other duties, yes, sir. Her voice was carefully modulated, trained not to startle the horses or upset the social order. Wolfe grunted and looked back at Mrs. Whitmore. You claim ownership of the ring Miss Pembroke returned to your son. I claim nothing, Mrs. Whitmore replied with the kind of precision that suggested she'd been preparing this speech. I state facts. The ring that woman returned is not the ring my son gave her. The original was a 12-carat pink diamond that belonged to my late mother-in-law. What was returned is a sapphire. A lovely stone, I grant you, but hardly the same thing. And you base this assertion on what evidence? Kerr cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore had the returned ring appraised by Quentin Thorne of Thorne & Sons. Mr. Thorne has been the family's jeweler for over 20 years and immediately identified the substitution. Ah. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, and I recognized the expression that crossed his face. It was the look he got when someone had just handed him exactly the piece of information he'd been hoping for. Mr. Thorne. The same gentleman who cleaned the original ring before Mr. Whitmore's proposal. Charles Whitmore spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the slight petulance of someone unaccustomed to having his word questioned. Yes, that's correct. I wanted the ring to be perfect when I presented it to Elena. Naturally. And during the time it was in Mr. Thorne's possession, you had no reason to suspect any irregularities. Of course not. Thorne has handled our family's jewelry for decades. The suggestion that he would— I suggest nothing, Wolfe interrupted. I merely establish facts. Miss Safford, you accompanied Mr. Whitmore to Mr. Thorne's establishment. The young woman glanced at Mrs. Whitmore before responding. Yes, sir. I managed Mr. Whitmore's appointments and accompanied him to ensure the timing was correct. We were there approximately 40 minutes. And you observed the ring during this visit? I saw Mr. Thorne examine it, yes. It was quite beautiful. A large pink stone surrounded by smaller diamonds. Wolfe was silent for a moment, his fingers steepled in front of him. Finally, he reached for the bell on his desk and pressed it. Fritz appeared with a bottle of beer, which Wolfe opened with the deliberate care of someone performing a sacred ritual. Mrs. Whitmore, he said after taking his first sip, you wish me to surrender the ring to you based on your assertion that it is not the ring your son originally gave to Miss Pembroke. I wish you to return stolen property to its rightful owners. Then you must prove ownership. Provide me with documented evidence, photographs, insurance records, appraisal certificates, establishing the provenance of your family's ring. Provide sworn statements from all parties who handled the ring between the time it left your safe deposit box and the time it was placed on Miss Pembroke's finger, and arrange for Mr. Thorne to visit this office at his earliest convenience. Kerr's face reddened. Mr. Wolfe, you have no authority to make such demands. I have the authority of possession, Wolfe replied calmly. The ring was entrusted to me by my client. If you wish to reclaim it, you will satisfy my requirements for establishing legitimate ownership. If you prefer to rely on bluster and indignation, you are welcome to test their effectiveness with the police. Mrs. Whitmore stood, gathering her dignity around her like a cloak. Very well. You will have your documentation by this evening. Lila, prepare the vault records and the insurance files. Charles, call Thorne and arrange his visit. She fixed Wolfe with a stare that could have cut glass. But understand this, Mr. Wolfe, we will not be deterred by procedural delays. That ring belongs to our family, and we will have it back. Madam, Wolfe said, not rising from his chair, if the ring belongs to your family, you will indeed have it back. If it does not, you will discover that fact as well. Truth, unlike ownership, cannot be claimed by assertion. After I'd seen them out, I returned to find Wolfe finishing his beer and staring thoughtfully at the closed door. Interesting group, I observed. Mrs. Whitmore has the subtlety of a brass band. Charles looks like he'd rather be anywhere else, and the lawyer smells like trouble. But the secretary, she's watching everything and saying nothing. Miss Safford, Wolfe agreed, bears watching. She accompanied Mr. Whitmore to the jeweler, observed the ring, and now finds herself in the uncomfortable position of being the only neutral witness to whatever transpired there. You think Thorne made the switch? I think, Archie, that Mr. Thorne's unexpected prominence in this affair, as both the cleaner of the original ring and the identifier of the substitution, suggests a level of involvement that warrants investigation. Wolfe set down his empty glass and looked at me. You will visit Mr. Thorne this afternoon. You will be charming, curious, and utterly relentless in your pursuit of the truth. And if he's not cooperative? Wolfe's smile was thin and predatory. Then we will know that as well. And Mr. Thorne will discover that there are disadvantages to playing games with people who make their living by understanding them. I grinned and reached for my hat. The brownstone had been disturbed, all right, but somehow I had the feeling that before this case was over, a lot more than our lunch hour was going to be disrupted. By 3:30, I was walking up Fifth Avenue with my hat at the proper angle and my questions arranged in order of increasing impertinence. Wolfe's instructions had been characteristically precise. Establish the timeline, identify the opportunities, and determine who had both motive and means to orchestrate Elena Pembroke's downfall. The fact that this involved visiting some of the city's more exclusive establishments was, I told myself, merely an occupational hazard. Thorne and Sons occupied a narrow building that managed to suggest both discretion and prosperity without being vulgar about either. The kind of place where you could discuss the provenance of a Maharaja's emeralds without anyone batting an eye, and where the staff treated $10,000 bracelets like they were costume jewelry if that's what the situation required. The man behind the mahogany counter was Quentin Thorne himself, somewhere in his 50s, with the pale complexion and precise movements of someone who spent his days examining small, valuable objects under bright lights. His gray hair was combed straight back, and he wore a jeweler's loop around his neck like a badge of office. Mr. Thorne, I approached with my most disarming smile. Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe. The name got a reaction, a slight tightening around the eyes that suggested he'd been expecting this visit and wasn't particularly looking forward to it. Yes, Mr. Goodwin. Mrs. Whitmore mentioned you might call. How can I help you? I'm trying to understand the sequence of events around the Whitmore ring. You cleaned it before Charles proposed to Elena Pembroke, and you later identified the stone that was returned as a substitution. That's quite a coincidence. Thorne's hands, which had been resting on the counter, moved to adjust a display of diamond earrings that didn't need adjusting. Not coincidence, Mr. Goodwin. Professional relationship. The Whitmore family has trusted us with their jewelry for over 20 years. Walk me through the cleaning process. Charles brought you the ring when? Approximately 10 days ago. It was routine. The stone needed cleaning, and he wanted the setting checked for security. The work took perhaps an hour. And you were alone with the ring during that time. Something flickered in Thorne's eyes. My assistant, Marcus Webb, helped with the cleaning, and Miss Safford accompanied Mr. Whitmore, of course. She waited in the consultation room while we worked. Interesting. Miss Safford seemed to be present at every crucial moment in this affair. Miss Safford waited here for an hour while you cleaned the ring. She's very dedicated to her duties. She brought correspondence to review, I believe. Thorne moved to a safe behind the counter and withdrew a manila folder. When I examined the returned ring for Mrs. Whitmore, the difference was immediately apparent. He spread several photographs on the mahogany surface. These are documentation photos I took of the original ring during the cleaning process. The photographs were professional quality, taken from multiple angles under different lighting conditions. The ring they showed was undeniably spectacular. A large pink diamond surrounded by smaller white stones, set in what looked like platinum. And the ring that was returned? I asked. He produced a second set of photographs. Sapphire, not diamond. Approximately 8 carats, beautifully cut, but unmistakably different in both composition and color. Even to my untrained eye, the differences were obvious once pointed out. The pink diamond had a warm, almost fiery quality, while the sapphire was cooler, deeper, more mysterious. Mr. Thorne, when do you believe the substitution was made? That's impossible to determine with certainty. The sapphire ring is fine work. It would have taken considerable time and skill to create. The substitution could have been made at any point after I returned the original to Mr. Whitmore. Or before. Thorne's face went carefully blank. I beg your pardon? The substitution could have been made before the ring came to you for cleaning. You could have cleaned the sapphire ring, photographed it as documentation, and no one would have been the wiser. Mr. Goodwin, that's a serious accusation. It's a serious possibility. Where's your assistant, Mr. Webb? Thorne hesitated, and in that hesitation I caught the scent of something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't quite innocence either. Marcus left our employ 3 days ago. Rather suddenly, I'm afraid. He said he'd received an offer from a firm in Chicago. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. Did he give notice? He worked his final day on Monday and left that evening. I was surprised by his departure. I made a note to track down the suddenly mobile Mr. Webb, thanked Thorne for his time, and left him standing behind his counter looking like a man who'd just realized his quiet, profitable life was about to become considerably more complicated. My next stop was Charles Whitmore's office, a glass and steel monument to inherited wealth and modern anxiety. Charles himself was behind a desk that could have doubled as a landing strip, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Mr. Goodwin, he said without enthusiasm, my mother said you might be calling. I really don't see what more I can add to what's already been established. Just trying to understand the timeline, Mr. Whitmore. You picked up the ring from Thorne and gave it to Miss Pembroke that same day. That evening, yes. We had dinner at Le Bernardin. I'd planned the whole thing carefully. The ring, the restaurant, the timing. I wanted everything to be perfect. His voice carried the kind of wistful regret that suggested he was mourning more than just a failed engagement. And you're certain it was the pink diamond when you gave it to her? Absolutely. I checked it when I picked it up from Thorne. Lila was with me. She always is for important appointments. She even commented on how beautiful the stone was. There was Miss Safford again, present at every crucial moment like a well-dressed shadow. Your secretary seems very thorough. Lila's invaluable. She's been with the family for 3 years now, and I honestly don't know how we managed without her. She handles everything, appointments, correspondence, family business. Mother relies on her completely. And during the 6 weeks Miss Pembroke wore the ring, did you notice anything unusual about it? Charles frowned, as if the question required more thought than he'd expected. I suppose I didn't pay much attention to the stone itself after the initial presentation. Elena wore it to functions, dinner parties, that sort of thing. It looked like the ring. I assumed. He stopped, and something shifted in his expression. There was one evening, at the museum benefit. Elena was talking with some donors, and I noticed her turning the ring on her finger. She seemed distracted by it. When I asked her about it later, she said it felt different somehow. Heavier, maybe. I thought she was just getting used to wearing it. That was interesting. Did she say anything else? She asked if I'd had it resized or altered in any way. I told her no, of course. Thorne had only cleaned it. Charles leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd arrived, he looked genuinely troubled. Mr. Goodwin, do you really think Elena stole the diamond? I think someone did. The question is who and why they wanted Miss Pembroke to take the blame. I left Charles looking like a man who'd just realized he might have been a pawn in someone else's game, which was probably closer to the truth than he wanted to admit. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in his chair with a glass of beer and the evening paper, looking like he hadn't moved since I'd left. I gave him a complete report of my afternoon's activities, including the photographs, Webb's convenient disappearance, and Miss Safford's omnipresence. Miss Safford, Wolfe said when I'd finished, appears to be the only constant in this equation. She's also the only person who was present for both the cleaning and the authentication, and doesn't have an obvious motive for deception. Or she's the person with the most sophisticated motive of all. Wolfe set down his beer and looked at me. Consider, Archie. A secretary in her position has access to family records, correspondence, financial information. She knows which bills are pressing, which investments are failing, which social obligations are becoming burdensome. If the Whitmore family were facing financial difficulties, and young Charles's comments about ventures and country houses suggest they might be, Miss Safford would be among the first to know. And the first to know that a 12-carat pink diamond might solve a lot of problems. Precisely. But selling the family heirloom would require explanation, documentation, insurance claims. Far simpler to arrange for it to be stolen by a woman who has publicly rejected the family's generosity. I thought about that. So she arranges for the switch to happen before Charles even proposes. He gives Elena the sapphire, thinking it's the diamond. When Elena returns it, Miss Safford is conveniently present to discover the substitution. And Elena Pembroke, having refused to join the family, becomes the perfect scapegoat. Her reputation is destroyed, the insurance claim is filed, and the Whitmores emerge as the injured party rather than the desperate one. What about Webb? His disappearance seems awfully convenient. Wolfe was quiet for a moment, his fingers steepled in front of him. Mr. Webb, I suspect, was either a willing accomplice who has now outlived his usefulness, or an unwilling witness who has decided that discretion is the better part of survival. Either way, his testimony would be valuable. Want me to track him down? Tomorrow. Tonight we wait for Mrs. Whitmore's documentation, and we prepare for the possibility that this case involves not just theft, but fraud on a considerable scale. As if summoned by our conversation, the phone rang. It was Elena Pembroke, and her voice carried a strain that hadn't been there that morning. Mr. Goodwin, I've had 3 more calls from board members suggesting I take a leave of absence until this is resolved. And the Times is running a small item in tomorrow's society section about questions surrounding a prominent philanthropist. They didn't use my name, but everyone will know who they mean. Hang tight, I told her. We're making progress. I hope so, because if this continues much longer, there won't be a reputation left to save. After I'd hung up, Wolfe was staring at the closed door with the expression he got when a case stopped being about money and started being about justice. Archie, he said, tomorrow you will find Mr. Webb, and you will arrange for Miss Safford to visit us here, alone. It's time we had a conversation with the lady who seems to know so much about so many things. I grinned and reached for my hat. The circle of suspects was drawn, all right, and sitting right in the middle of it was a young woman who might be a lot more dangerous than her quiet efficiency suggested. In this business, the quiet ones usually are. The next morning brought the kind of crisp October air that makes a man glad to be alive and walking the streets of Manhattan, even when his destination involves tracking down a suddenly unemployed jeweler's assistant who might be the key to unraveling a sophisticated theft. Wolfe's instructions had been characteristically precise. Find Marcus Webb, determine what he knew about the ring switch, and establish whether Lila Safford was the architect of Elena Pembroke's downfall or merely an exceptionally well-informed observer. I started at Thorne & Sons, figuring that a man doesn't vanish completely without leaving some trace of his intentions. Quentin Thorne looked like he'd spent the night wrestling with his conscience and losing. His usually immaculate appearance was slightly rumpled, and his hands shook as he adjusted the jeweler's loop around his neck. Mr. Goodwin, he said without enthusiasm, I've told you everything I know about Marcus Webb's departure. Have you? Because I'm curious about the timing. A valued employee leaves suddenly for Chicago, but you don't have a forwarding address, and the temporary agency that supposedly placed him can't reach him either. That's not how people start new jobs, Mr. Thorne. That's how they disappear. Thorne's face went pale. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating that Marcus Webb didn't go to Chicago, and I think you know it. The question is whether you're going to help me find him before this situation gets considerably worse for everyone involved." After 10 minutes of gentle pressure and the suggestion that obstruction of justice charges were unpleasant for established businessmen, Thorne produced Webb's last known address, a rooming house on the Lower East Side, where the rent was cheap and the questions were few. The Meridian Hotel was the kind of establishment that catered to people who needed to be invisible for a while. The desk clerk, a thin man with the complexion of someone who'd given up on sunlight, took my $20 bill and pointed me toward the 4th floor. I found Marcus Webb in room 412, a nervous young man with prematurely gray hair and the haunted expression of someone carrying around guilty knowledge. When I knocked and identified myself, the silence that followed was the kind that comes from a man trying to decide whether to run, hide, or face the music. "Mr. Goodwin," he said when he finally opened the door. "I wondered when someone would come looking for me." Webb's room was clean but sparse, containing little more than a bed, a chair, and the tools of his trade arranged on a small table. He perched on the edge of the bed while I took the chair, and I could see his hands trembling as he tried to maintain his composure. "Let's start with the basics," I said, giving him my most reassuring smile. "You worked for Thorne & Sons until Monday. You helped clean the Whitmore ring, and now you're hiding out in a hotel room. What happened?" "I'm not hiding," Webb said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I got a better offer, a jeweler in Chicago." "Marcus, I called every major jewelry establishment in Chicago this morning. None of them has heard of you, so let's try again. What really happened with the Whitmore ring?" His composure cracked like an eggshell. He put his head in his hands and made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. "God, what a mess," he said. "I never wanted any part of this. I just needed the money." "What money?" $5,000. Cash, for keeping my mouth shut about what I saw. Webb looked up, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and fear. I saw Miss Safford switch the rings. Now we were getting somewhere. "Tell me exactly what happened." Webb took a shaky breath and began his story. "It was last Thursday when Charles Whitmore brought the ring in for cleaning. Thorne was in the back preparing the cleaning solution, and Webb was setting up the photography equipment they used to document valuable pieces. Lila Safford was waiting in the consultation room, as she always did during Whitmore family business. She asked if she could use the restroom," Webb continued, "but she came back through the workshop instead of the corridor. Said she'd gotten turned around. While she was there, she admired the ring, asked if she could look at it more closely. Mr. Thorne was still in the back, so I let her handle it. She seemed to know quite a lot about jewelry." "How long did she have it?" "Maybe 2 minutes. She was very careful, very respectful. She even complimented the craftsmanship, but when she handed it back..." Webb paused, rubbing his forehead. "Something was different. The weight, maybe, or the way the light hit the stone. I almost said something, but then Mr. Thorne came back, and Miss Safford returned to the consultation room." "You think she made the switch during those 2 minutes?" "I know she did. After they left, I examined the stone under magnification. It was beautiful work. The sapphire was cut to almost exactly the same dimensions as the original diamond. But the inclusions were different. The color spectrum was different. It wasn't the same stone." Webb had tried to tell Thorne about his suspicions, but the older man had dismissed them, saying the workshop lighting could play tricks on the eyes. He'd seemed upset by the suggestion and told Webb to forget about it and not mention it to anyone. But Webb hadn't forgotten, and apparently neither had Lila Safford. She'd called him Sunday night, saying she understood he might have concerns about the ring and suggesting they meet to discuss them. They'd met Monday morning at a coffee shop on Lexington Avenue. She was very pleasant, very understanding, Webb said, his voice bitter now. Said she knew I was a conscientious employee who took pride in his work. She also said she knew I had student loans and that my mother's medical bills were becoming a burden. The woman had done her homework. She knew exactly how much Webb owed, exactly how much his mother's treatments cost, exactly how much his salary at Thorne's covered and how much it didn't. She'd offered him $5,000 to quit his job immediately and leave New York for a few months, calling it a generous severance package for a valued employee. And if you refused, she didn't threaten exactly, but she made it clear that she had friends in the jewelry business and that accusations of theft against a young employee with financial difficulties would be taken very seriously. She also mentioned that my mother's insurance was through a company that did considerable business with Whitmore interests. It was elegant. Bribe, threat, and insurance leverage all wrapped up in a package that looked like generosity. Webb had taken the money, given his notice, and come to the hotel to wait for things to cool down. Lila had said someone would contact him with details about the Chicago position once the current situation was resolved. But no one has contacted you, I observed. No one. And after 3 days of watching the news and waiting for the phone to ring, I'm starting to think that maybe Miss Safford's generosity has limits. I studied Webb's face, looking for signs of deception and finding only fear and regret. Marcus, I'm going to ask you to do something that requires considerable courage. I want you to come with me to see Nero Wolfe. I want you to tell him everything you've told me. I can't. She'll destroy me. My mother, she's already destroying you. The only question is whether you're going to let her do it quietly or fight back. I leaned forward, putting as much conviction as I could into my voice. Marcus, Miss Safford is counting on your fear to keep you silent. But if you help us prove she stole that diamond, you become a hero instead of an accomplice. After considerable persuasion and my assurance that Wolfe could provide protection for both Webb and his mother, the young man agreed to come with me. But first, I wanted to examine his room more carefully. In the small table drawer, I found an envelope from Thorne & Sons with the ghost impressions of cash still pressed into the paper. In the wastebasket, a strip of masking tape with blue dust embedded in the adhesive, the kind of residue left by sapphire polishing compound, and tucked behind the radiator, a business card for Montalvo Insurance Adjusting on East 45th Street. The insurance card, I said, holding it up. Where did this come from? Webb's face went white. Miss Safford dropped it during our meeting. I picked it up and forgot to give it back to her. Another piece of the puzzle. Lila Safford wasn't just orchestrating the theft. She was preparing the insurance claim as well. Before returning to the brownstone, I decided to pay an unscheduled visit to the Whitmore mansion on the Upper East Side. If Lila Safford was as indispensable as everyone claimed, she'd likely be there, managing Mrs. Whitmore's daily affairs. The Whitmore mansion was a monument to old money. Stone lions, impossibly tall windows, and the kind of understated grandeur that whispered rather than shouted its importance. A butler with the gravitas of a Supreme Court justice answered the door, and after a brief negotiation involving my most charming smile and a carefully constructed lie about expected appointments, I found myself face to face with Lila Safford herself. She appeared in the marble foyer, dressed in a tailored gray suit that looked expensive but utterly unremarkable. The kind of outfit designed to help its wearer blend into the background of wealthy households. Her gray eyes, however, were sharp and missed nothing. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, her voice betraying no surprise. "I wasn't aware you had an appointment." "My apologies, Miss Safford. But Mr. Wolfe has a few questions that only you might be able to clarify, specifically about your observations during the ring's various transitions and your unique perspective on the family's concerns." I watched her carefully as I spoke, noting the slight tightening around her eyes when I mentioned Wolfe's interest in her observations. She was controlled, professional, but there was something underneath, a wariness that suggested she'd been expecting this conversation and wasn't looking forward to it. "I'm rather busy, Mr. Goodwin. Mrs. Whitmore has a charity luncheon." "Of course. And that's precisely why Mr. Wolfe thought it best if you could come to the brownstone. He's concerned about discretion, you see." Wouldn't want to cause any undue speculation among the staff or Mrs. Whitmore's guests about this unfortunate misunderstanding. That hit home. Her composure wavered slightly as she considered the implications of a detective asking pointed questions in the Whitmore drawing room while society ladies nibbled canapes. "Mr. Wolfe wishes to see me." "He does. He feels your unique perspective, having been present at so many key moments, is invaluable. Perhaps tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, before his orchid schedule demands his attention." She agreed, and I left her standing in that marble foyer looking like a woman who'd just realized her carefully constructed world was about to be subjected to very uncomfortable scrutiny. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in his office with Marcus Webb settled in the red leather chair, telling his story with the careful precision of someone who'd finally decided that the truth was less dangerous than silence. Wolfe listened without interruption, his eyes half closed, his fingers steepled in front of him. When Webb finished, Wolfe was quiet for nearly a minute. Finally, he opened his eyes and fixed them on our visitor. "Mr. Webb," he said, "you have been the victim of a sophisticated manipulation. Miss Safford identified you as a potential weakness in her plan and took steps to neutralize that weakness through bribery and intimidation. The question now is whether you are prepared to help us turn that weakness into her downfall." After Webb had been settled in the South Room as our guest, I gave Wolfe a complete report of my afternoon's activities, including the insurance connection and my successful manipulation of Lila Safford's protective instincts regarding the Whitmore reputation. "She'll be here tomorrow at 10, I concluded, "and she's nervous about what questions you might ask." Wolfe leaned back in his chair with an expression of deep satisfaction. "Miss Safford has made the classic mistake of the overconfident criminal, Archie. She has been too thorough in her preparations. Her knowledge of Mr. Webb's financial situation, her immediate response to his concerns, her ready solution to his problems, all of it points to extensive planning and careful research. Which suggests that this theft was not opportunistic. It was carefully planned, probably months in advance. And if Miss Safford has been planning this for months, she has made other preparations as well." Wolfe's smile was thin and predatory. "Tomorrow we will discover what they are and how we can use them against her." I grinned and reached for my hat. The legwork was done, the trap was set, and tomorrow we'd find out just how smart Lila Safford really thought she was. In my experience, that kind of confidence usually comes right before the fall. I woke Thursday morning to the sound of Fritz muttering in French, which is never a good sign. When Fritz abandons English for his native tongue, it usually means someone has committed an unforgivable sin against the natural order of his kitchen. I found him standing at his spice rack like a general surveying a battlefield, his face wearing the expression of a man who discovered vandals in his cathedral. "The violation discovered. Archie," he said without turning around. "Someone has been in my kitchen." Fritz's kitchen was his sacred domain, organized with the precision of a Swiss chronometer and maintained with the devotion of a monk tending his manuscripts. Every jar, every utensil, every grain of salt had its appointed place, and nothing moved without his knowledge and consent. If Fritz said someone had been in his kitchen, then someone had committed what amounted to sacrilege. "What's missing?" I asked, though something about his posture suggested the answer wouldn't be that simple. "Nothing is missing. That is precisely the problem." Fritz gestured toward his spice collection with the controlled fury of a man whose life's work had been casually violated. "The Hungarian paprika, Mr. Wolfe's special paprika from the village near Szeged. It has been replaced." He handed me a small, ornate jar that looked identical to the dozens of others on his shelves. To my untrained eye, it contained what appeared to be perfectly normal paprika, the same deep red color, the same fine texture, the same subtle aroma that Wolfe prized above rubies. "Fritz, this looks like—" "It looks like paprika, yes. It smells almost like paprika, but it lacks the depth, the complexity, the subtle smokiness that distinguishes the genuine article. This is an imitation, a clever one, perhaps, but an imitation nonetheless. Fritz's voice carried the kind of controlled outrage usually reserved for matters of international diplomacy. Someone studied Mr. Wolfe's paprika carefully enough to find a substitute that would fool a casual observer, but not carefully enough to fool me. The evidence trail. I took the jar to Wolfe's office, where he was already settled with his morning beer and the Times. When I explained Fritz's discovery, his eyebrows rose perhaps 1/4 of an inch, for him, equivalent to standing up and applauding. "Indeed," he said, taking the jar and subjecting it to the kind of careful examination usually reserved for evidence in capital cases. He opened it, inhaled deeply, then touched a tiny amount to his tongue with the tip of his little finger. His expression grew thoughtful, then dangerous. "Fritz is correct. This is a competent but ultimately inferior substitute." Wolfe set the jar on his desk with the deliberate precision of a man placing a chess piece. "The question is not whether we have been trespassed upon, but why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to demonstrate their ability to do so." Before I could respond, Fritz appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who discovered additional outrages against the natural order. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "I've examined the kitchen more carefully. The back door lock shows signs of manipulation, tiny scratches around the keyhole that were not there yesterday. And I found this on the floor near the spice rack." He held up a small evidence envelope containing what looked like blue powder. Even from across the room, I could see it had the same metallic sheen as the residue jewelers use when polishing precious stones. "Sapphire dust," Wolfe observed, though he didn't touch the envelope. "Or perhaps diamond polishing compound. Someone with experience in gem work has been in our kitchen, Archie. Someone who wanted us to know they had been here, but who also wanted to leave a calling card that only we would understand. The psychological warfare. I did a complete sweep of the ground floor and found additional evidence of our midnight visitor's presence. The safe in Wolfe's office showed faint fingerprint smears around the dial. Not enough to compromise the lock, but enough to indicate someone had tested its defenses. The phone junction box in the hall had been examined, though not tampered with. Even the library windows showed signs of careful inspection, though they remained secure. "This wasn't a burglary," I reported when I'd finished my survey. "This was reconnaissance. Someone wanted to know our security arrangements, our daily routines, our vulnerabilities. They took nothing and damaged nothing, but they left enough evidence to make sure we'd know they'd been here." Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Miss Safford," he said quietly. "Has to be. She was here yesterday, had the opportunity to observe the layout, maybe even to lift a key if she was clever enough. But why tip her hand like this? Why let us know she can get in?" "Because, Archie, she believes she can intimidate us into abandoning the case. She has demonstrated that our defenses are not impregnable, that our sanctuary can be violated at will. She expects us to conclude that discretion is the better part of valor and withdraw from the field." Wolfe's voice carried the kind of quiet anger that was more dangerous than shouting. Someone had violated the brownstone, had entered his kitchen, had dared to tamper with his paprika. In Wolfe's universe, such acts were not merely criminal. They were personal. The strategic response. "What's our move?" I asked. "We escalate." Wolfe pressed the bell on his desk, and Fritz appeared almost instantly. "Fritz, you will secure all entrances with additional internal bolts. You will ensure that no one gains access to any part of this house without your direct knowledge, and you will obtain a fresh supply of paprika from our usual source." Fritz nodded with the grim determination of a man preparing for siege warfare. "And Archie," Wolfe continued, "you will call Saul Panzer immediately. Tell him I require comprehensive surveillance of Miss Lila Safford, beginning at once. I want to know where she goes, whom she sees, what she does between now and her 10 o'clock appointment. If she so much as purchases a newspaper, I want to know the headline." I reached for the phone, but Wolfe wasn't finished. You will also call Mr. Webb and ensure he understands that his safety depends upon remaining in the south room until this matter is resolved. If Miss Safford is bold enough to violate my kitchen, she may be desperate enough to silence the one witness who can connect her to the ring. Substitution. The trap is set by 9:30. Saul was positioned across the street with a clear view of the Safford apartment building. Fred Durkin was watching the Whitmore mansion in case our suspect decided to coordinate with her employers, and Marcus Webb was secure in the south room with instructions to answer the door for no one except Fritz or myself. At 9:55, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Lila Safford standing on our stoop, dressed in her usual understated gray and carrying herself with the composed professionalism that had served her so well in the Whitmore household. But there was something different about her this morning. A tension around her eyes, a slight stiffness in her posture that suggested she was prepared for battle. "Miss Safford," I said, stepping aside to let her enter. "Punctual as always." "Mr. Wolfe values precision," she replied, moving past me toward the office. But I noticed she paused for just a moment in the hallway, her eyes taking in the new security measures Fritz had installed that morning. She knew we'd discovered her midnight visit, and she knew we'd responded. When we reached the office, she settled into the red leather chair with the careful grace of someone who understood she was walking into a trap, but believed she was clever enough to spring it from the inside. Wolfe studied her for a long moment, his eyes taking in every detail of her appearance, her posture, her carefully controlled breathing. "Miss Safford," he said finally, "you have had a busy night." Her composure didn't waver, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that meant his words had hit home. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wolfe. I don't understand." "Don't you? Then perhaps you can explain why someone with access to Jeweler's polishing compound felt compelled to examine my kitchen spices in the early hours of this morning." For the first time since she'd entered the office, Lila Safford's professional mask slipped slightly. Not much. Just enough to confirm that Wolfe had scored a direct hit. "Mr. Wolfe," she said carefully, "if someone broke into your house, perhaps you should contact the police." "Oh, I intend to contact the police, Miss Safford. But first, I thought you might like to explain why you believe that violating my home would advance your cause rather than destroy it." The battle lines were drawn. Lila Safford sat in perfect silence, her gray eyes fixed on Wolfe's face, while he regarded her with the patient intensity of a spider, waiting for its web to vibrate. The brownstone had been trespassed upon, but the trespass had revealed more about the trespasser than she had intended. And in 10 minutes, when Saul called with his first report, we would begin to discover just how deep Miss Safford's deceptions really went. The subtle trespass had been her declaration of war. Now we would see who was better equipped to fight it. The phone rang at 10:12, and Saul Panzer's voice carried the kind of professional satisfaction that meant he'd uncovered something worth the surveillance fee. I answered while keeping my eyes on Lila Safford, who sat in the red leather chair with the composed stillness of someone who knew she was walking a tightrope but believed she could reach the other side. "Archie," Saul said without preamble, "your Miss Safford had an interesting morning. Left her building at 7:15, walked 6 blocks to avoid the nearest subway stop, and took a circuitous route to a coffee shop on East 45th. Met a man there. 50s. Expensive suit, briefcase that probably cost more than most people's cars. They exchanged envelopes, spoke for exactly 4 minutes, and parted. I followed him to Montalvo Insurance Adjusting. The network exposed. I made notes while Saul continued. After the meeting, she went straight to the Whitmore mansion, stayed 40 minutes, came out with what looked like files. Then she made 3 phone calls from a booth on Madison. The last one ended with her slamming down the receiver hard enough to rattle the glass. Current status? She's got watchers now. 2-man team in a gray Lincoln, professional grade. They picked her up after the bank visit and they're still with her. License traces to a rental company that does a lot of work for insurance investigators. I thanked Saul and hung up, noting that Lila Safford's hands had tightened almost imperceptibly on the arms of her chair during my conversation. Wolfe had been listening with the focused attention of a spider feeling vibrations in its web. "Miss Safford," Wolfe said quietly, "your breakfast meeting with Mr. Montalvo appears to have been productive. Insurance fraud requires such careful preparation." For the first time since entering the office, Lila's professional composure showed genuine cracks. Her face went pale, and I caught the slight tremor in her voice when she responded, "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you? Then perhaps you can explain the business card for Montalvo Insurance Adjusting that you dropped in Mr. Webb's hotel room, or the envelope you deposited at Madison Trust this morning, or why insurance investigators are now conducting surveillance of your movements." Before she could answer, the doorbell rang with a kind of authoritative persistence that meant official business. Fritz appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who'd been expecting bad news and had just received confirmation. "Inspector Kramer and Sergeant Stebbins," he announced, "with papers." Official pressure. I went to the door and found Inspector Kramer looking like a man who'd been dragged away from more interesting crimes to deal with what he probably considered a society squabble. Behind him stood Sergeant Stebbins and the sharp-nosed lawyer, Avery Kerr, who wore the expression of someone about to enjoy watching his enemies squirm. "Wolfe," Kramer said without preamble, "I've got a warrant to seize evidence. In a grand larceny case, specifically one ring that you're holding and shouldn't be." Kerr produced the legal documents with a flourish. "The Whitmore family has provided sworn statements that the ring in your possession was obtained through fraud. We're here to recover stolen property." Wolfe didn't rise from his chair, but his eyes moved over the warrant with the careful attention he usually reserved for examining orchid specimens. "Inspector, you will find the document in order. Archie, you will retrieve the ring from the safe. But first, Mr. Kramer will acknowledge for the record that the item being seized is an 8-carat sapphire, not a 12-carat pink diamond." Kramer grunted his agreement, and I fetched the jewelry box from the safe. When I opened it on Wolfe's desk, the sapphire caught the office light and threw it back in brilliant blue flashes. "Looks blue to me," Kramer observed, making a note on his receipt. "If this is your evidence, Wolfe, you're lighter than usual." "Inspector," Wolfe replied with something that might have been amusement in a less controlled man, "evidence comes in many forms. You have removed a trinket. You have not altered the fundamental mathematics of the case." After the police left with the ring and Kerr's satisfied smirk, I returned to find Wolfe contemplating the empty space on his desk where the jewelry box had been. Lila Safford sat rigid in her chair, watching him with the expression of someone who'd just realized her careful plans were unraveling faster than she could repair them. The pressure mounts. The phone rang again. Elena Pembroke, her usually controlled voice running slightly too fast. "Mr. Goodwin, someone's been busy destroying my reputation. The Post is running a story about a society philanthropist at the center of an heirloom scandal, and they have a photograph of me wearing the ring at the museum benefit. Worse, I just had a call from my bank. Apparently, my assistant made a large safe deposit box entry on Monday. I don't have an assistant." I covered the mouthpiece and relayed the information to Wolfe, whose eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, his equivalent of standing up and applauding. "Miss Pembroke," Wolfe said when I handed him the phone, "you will make no statements to anyone. Mr. Goodwin will visit your bank immediately to secure the visitor logs and camera footage, and you will inform the Post that any further publication without verification will result in litigation." After he'd hung up, Wolfe turned his attention back to Lila Safford, who was now visibly struggling to maintain her composure. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the coffee Fritz had served, and there was a sheen of perspiration on her forehead despite the cool October morning. "Miss Safford," Wolfe said gently, Your associates appear to be accelerating their timeline. The false safe deposit entry is designed to establish a chain of culpability. Miss Pembroke returns the ring, discovers she's been found out, and attempts to hide the real diamond. Clever, but ultimately flawed. "You don't understand," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Whitmores are finished, not just cash poor, actually bankrupt. Charles's investments have failed. The house is mortgaged beyond its value, and Mrs. Whitmore's medical treatments are consuming what little they have left. The ring was their only remaining asset of real value." The truth emerges. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, and I recognized the expression that crossed his face. The look he got when human nature revealed itself in all its complicated desperation. "So you decided to solve their financial crisis through insurance fraud, with Miss Pembroke as your scapegoat." "She deserved it," Lila said, and for the first time her professional mask slipped completely, revealing the anger underneath. "She humiliated Charles, rejected the family's generosity, made them look foolish in front of everyone who matters. She was supposed to be grateful, supposed to accept her place in their world. Instead, she threw it all back in their faces." "And you appointed yourself to deliver justice?" Before Lila could respond, the phone rang a third time. This time it was Marcus Webb, calling from the south room, his voice tight with fear. "Mr. Goodwin, there are men watching the house, 2 of them in a car across the street. They've been there for 20 minutes and they're not trying to be subtle about it." I looked at Wolfe, whose expression had shifted from analytical to dangerous. "Marcus, stay away from the windows and don't open the door for anyone except Fritz or me." After I'd hung up, Wolfe fixed Lila Safford with a stare that could have frozen champagne. "Miss Safford, your associates appear to have decided that Mr. Webb represents an unacceptable risk to their operation. If any harm comes to him or to anyone else in this house, I will ensure that you face charges far more serious than fraud." Lila had gone completely white. "I never authorized violence. This was supposed to be simple. Miss Safford, there is no such thing as simple insurance fraud involving 12-carat diamonds and ruined reputations. The moment you decided to destroy Eleanor Pembroke's life to cover your theft, you crossed the line from property crime to something far more dangerous." Wolfe stood, a gesture so rare and dramatic that it made Lila flinch visibly. "You have 30 seconds to decide whether you wish to cooperate with my investigation or face the consequences of your associates' escalating desperation." The breaking point. The pressure had reached its crescendo. Outside, unknown men were conducting surveillance. The police had seized our primary evidence. Insurance investigators were building a case based on manufactured evidence. And in the red leather chair, Lila Safford was finally beginning to understand that her sophisticated deception had become a runaway locomotive with herself tied to the tracks. She looked around the office, at Wolfe standing like an immovable force of nature, at me with my notebook and my questions, at the empty space where the ring had been. And I could see the exact moment when her nerve finally broke. "What do you want to know?" she whispered. Wolfe settled back into his chair with the satisfaction of a man who'd just achieved checkmate in a particularly challenging game. "Everything, Miss Safford, from the beginning. And this time, I suggest you tell the truth. Your associates may have decided that you've outlived your usefulness, but I am prepared to offer you something they cannot." "What's that?" "Justice," Wolfe said simply, "but only if you earn it." The increased pressure had accomplished exactly what it was designed to do. Lila Safford's carefully constructed world was collapsing, and she was finally ready to tell us how she'd built it in the first place. The question was whether her confession would come in time to save Marcus Webb, Elena Pembroke's reputation, and quite possibly all of our lives. If you want to understand the difference between interrogation and intellectual warfare, watch Nero Wolfe dismantle a criminal conspiracy using nothing more than a telephone, perfect grammar, and the kind of strategic patience that makes chess masters weep with envy. Lila Safford sat in the red leather chair like a woman watching her life's work crumble into expensive dust, and Wolfe was about to show her exactly how thoroughly she'd miscalculated. The confession begins. "Miss Safford," Wolfe said with the kind of calm that precedes devastating revelations, "you will now provide a complete account of your deception. Not a narrative. Answers to questions. Precision will save you. Elaboration will condemn you." She swallowed hard, her professional composure finally abandoned. When she spoke, her voice carried the hollow quality of someone who'd finally realized that cleverness and desperation make dangerous partners. "It started 18 months ago," she began, her hands trembling as she reached for the coffee Fritz had served. Mrs. Whitmore's experimental medical treatments were costing $300,000 a year. Charles's technology investments were failing one after another. He'd lost nearly $2 million in 6 months. The foundation accounts were being drained to cover personal expenses. I handled all the banking, saw every statement, every overdraft notice. They had perhaps 4 months before complete financial collapse. Wolfe's fingers steepled in front of him. The diamond represented salvation. $2 million in insurance value, she confirmed, but selling it openly would mean admitting their situation, accepting charity, losing the social position that was all they had left. Mrs. Whitmore would rather have died than let society know how far they'd fallen. The architecture of deception. I kept my pen moving as Lila detailed the sophisticated fraud she'd constructed. She'd been taking jewelry courses at night, ostensibly for personal enrichment, but actually to understand gem identification and substitution techniques. She'd researched insurance policies, legal loopholes, and the precise procedures for high-value claims. "I commissioned the sapphire replica 6 months ago," she continued. "Found Marcus Webb through a jeweler's supply company where I'd been purchasing tools and materials. He was skilled, desperate for money to cover his mother's medical bills, and naive enough to believe my story about wanting to surprise Charles with a reproduction for display purposes. The replica had cost $15,000, money she'd been skimming from household accounts over 6 months. 8 carats, platinum setting, surrounded by genuine diamonds from stones she'd purchased separately. Beautiful work that would fool casual inspection, but never survive professional scrutiny. When Charles decided to propose to Elena Pembroke, I suggested he have the ring cleaned and inspected first. I accompanied him to Thorne & Sons, made the substitution during my carefully choreographed bathroom confusion, and watched him unknowingly present Elena with my beautiful fake. Wolfe grunted. Miss Pembroke was supposed to accept the proposal. She was supposed to marry into the family, wear the ring proudly, never question its authenticity. The original diamond would be safely in my possession, and no one would ever examine the replica closely enough to detect the substitution. For the first time since beginning her confession, Lila's voice carried genuine anger. She ruined everything. Charles was devastated, Mrs. Whitmore was humiliated, and suddenly I had a problem. Elena was returning a ring that wasn't the original. The scapegoat strategy. "So you decided to make Miss Pembroke the thief," Wolfe observed. "I decided to make her the scapegoat. If she'd stolen the diamond and replaced it with a fake, the insurance would still pay, and the family would be seen as victims rather than desperate aristocrats selling their heritage." The insurance angle had required Vincent Montalvo, whom she'd found through contacts at the jewelry school. A man who specialized in high-value claims and wasn't particular about ethics. For 30% of the payout, Montalvo had agreed to expedite the claim and ensure the investigation reached the correct conclusions. Montalvo arranged for Elena's financial records to be scrutinized, her movements to be monitored, her reputation to be quietly undermined. When nothing suspicious appeared, he suggested we create evidence. The false safe deposit box entry, the selective leaks to the press, the carefully timed discoveries. All Montalvo's professional touches, designed to build an unshakable case against Elena Pembroke. Wolfe's strategic response. When Lila finished her confession, Wolfe was silent for nearly a minute, his eyes half closed in thought. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of dangerous calm that meant someone was about to discover they'd made a fatal miscalculation. "Miss Safford, your plan contains a fundamental flaw that betrays both its amateur conception and its inevitable failure. You assumed that Miss Pembroke would accept disgrace quietly rather than fight to clear her name. But you failed to consider that a woman who builds hospitals and feeds the hungry might possess the moral courage to demand justice, regardless of the cost." Before Lila could respond, Wolfe pressed the bell on his desk. Fritz appeared with the silent efficiency of a man who'd been expecting this summons. "Fritz, escort Miss Safford to the south room. She will remain there with Mr. Webb as our guests. Their safety is paramount. No one enters or leaves without my express permission." As Fritz led a surprisingly compliant Lila away, Wolfe reached for the telephone and began the methodical process of positioning his pieces for the final confrontation. The tactical deployment. His first call was to Saul Panzer. "Mr. Panzer, 2 directives. First, identify the surveillance team outside. I want names, employers, and current instructions. Second, locate Vincent Montalvo and determine his immediate plans. Work from his insurance office outward. Report hourly." The second call went to Inspector Kramer, and the exchange carried the familiar flavor of grudging respect seasoned with professional necessity. "Inspector, you have my house under informal observation by private parties connected to an insurance adjuster engaged in, at best, overzealousness. I will not have it. Either clear them or own them." Wolfe waited out Kramer's growl. "Also, you seized an 8-carat sapphire this morning and left behind evidence of a burglary. Scratches on locks, foreign residue, and witnesses in danger. You may send Sergeant Stebbins to document. I am busy." The third call was to Lon Cohen at the Gazette. Wolfe doesn't love newspapers, but he respects a clean lever. "Mr. Cohen, you will run 37 words in your late edition. Nero Wolfe to confer with parties in contested heirloom case this evening. Attendance required. Absence will be construed as confession. No names, but sufficient detail to disrupt any departure schedules." Setting the stage with the tactical elements in place, Wolfe turned his attention to the evening's main event. He dictated invitations for Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, Charles Whitmore, Avery Kerr, Quentin Thorne, and Vincent Montalvo. 8 o'clock. His office. The matter of title to a pink diamond. "Archie, you will deliver these personally. You will observe reactions, note attempts at coordination, and ensure that each recipient understands the consequences of non-attendance." "A little strong?" I asked, reading the formal language. "It will stiffen the faint and frighten the bold. Precisely the effect we require." I spent the afternoon working the route of professional disgrace. At Kerr and Molyneux. Avery. Kerr took the envelope with hands that shook slightly when I mentioned the Gazette item. At the Whitmore mansion, Mrs. Whitmore accepted the invitation with the air of a queen receiving a declaration of war, while Charles hovered behind her with the expression of a man who'd finally realized that consequences weren't hypothetical. Quentin Thorne received his summons with the pale composure of someone who'd been expecting this moment and dreading it in equal measure. And Vincent Montalvo, reached by telephone at his insurance office, attempted buttery charm until Wolfe cut him off with surgical precision. The final positioning. By 7:30, the brownstone had been transformed into a fortress and a theater simultaneously. Fritz had installed additional security measures with the grim efficiency of a man preparing for siege warfare. Sergeant Stebbins had documented the break-in evidence and posted a patrol car at the curb. And in the south room, Lila Safford and Marcus Webb waited under protection, their testimonies secured, and their safety guaranteed. Wolfe surveyed the office with the satisfaction of a general who'd positioned his forces exactly where he wanted them. The chairs were arranged with geometric precision, not housekeeping, but strategic positioning that would give truth the best acoustics and lies the worst sight lines. "Archie," he said, as the clock approached 8. "Tonight we will demonstrate the difference between cleverness and wisdom, between deception and truth, between those who prey upon the innocent and those who protect them." The invitations had been delivered, the evidence secured, and the trap set with the kind of intellectual precision that made chess look like checkers. Vincent Montalvo and his associates were about to discover that violating Nero Wolfe's kitchen was the least of their mistakes. The positioning was complete. All that remained was to spring the trap and watch sophisticated criminals discover that there are disadvantages to playing games with people who make their living by understanding them. In my experience, that kind of education usually comes with a very high price. At 2 minutes to 8, Fritz opened the front door on what could only be described as a parade of self-importance, anxiety, and barely concealed desperation. They arrived in the order I would have scripted if I'd been staging the thing for maximum dramatic effect, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore leading the charge like a general who'd just discovered her army was in full retreat, followed by Charles, looking like a man who'd finally realized that consequences weren't just theoretical concepts, and Avery Kerr, wearing his sharp suit-like armor that might not be quite thick enough for the evening's requirements. The adversaries assemble. Quentin Thorne came next, his jeweler's precision evident even in his nervous movements as he adjusted his tie with hands that trembled slightly. The final arrival was Vincent Montalvo, a man in his 50s who wore expensive suits like they were weapons and carried himself with the calculated confidence of someone who'd made a career of turning other people's disasters into his own profit margins. I led them to the office, where Wolfe sat behind his desk like a judge who'd already reviewed all the evidence and was simply waiting for the formalities to conclude. The chairs had been arranged in a precise semicircle, not for comfort, but for strategic positioning that would give truth the best acoustics and lies the worst sight lines. Mrs. Whitmore claimed the center position with the unconscious authority of someone who'd never doubted her right to command any room she entered. Charles hovered behind her left shoulder like a man seeking shelter from an approaching storm. Kerr positioned himself where he could see everyone's faces. Thorne took the chair farthest from the desk, and Montalvo settled opposite Kerr with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was the smartest person in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began without preamble, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that made argument seem not just futile, but slightly ridiculous. "You are here because each of you has played a role in a sophisticated deception designed to defraud an insurance company and destroy an innocent woman's reputation. Before this evening concludes, you will understand exactly how that deception was constructed, who orchestrated it, and why it has failed so completely." The foundation exposed. Mrs. Whitmore's spine stiffened like a ramrod. "Mr. Wolfe, I hardly think—" "Madam, you will think precisely what the evidence compels you to think, and you will speak only when I require clarification." Wolfe's interruption was delivered with the casual precision of a surgeon making an incision. "The foundation of this deception lies in your family's financial collapse. 18 months ago, you faced bankruptcy. Medical expenses, failed investments, and dwindling assets had reduced you from wealth to genteel poverty with approximately 4 months before complete ruin." Charles went pale, but he didn't interrupt. The truth, apparently, was more devastating than he'd expected. Your only remaining asset of significant value was a 12-carat pink diamond insured for $2 million, but impossible to sell without admitting your desperate circumstances. Miss Lila Safford, who managed your financial affairs and was therefore intimately familiar with your situation, conceived a plan to solve your crisis through insurance fraud. I consulted my notebook and continued the narrative. 6 months ago, Miss Safford commissioned an 8-carat sapphire replica of the original ring. The work was exceptional, beautiful enough to fool casual inspection, distinctive enough to be easily identified by experts and expensive enough to suggest legitimate ownership. Wolfe's gaze moved methodically over each face, cataloguing reactions with the precision of a scientist studying specimens. The substitution occurred at Thorne & Sons during the ring's routine cleaning. Miss Safford, accompanying Mr. Charles Whitmore, as she always did for family business, created a carefully choreographed distraction that allowed her to switch the original diamond for her commissioned replica. The witness emerges. Before anyone could object, Wolfe pressed the bell on his desk. Fritz appeared with the silent efficiency of a man who'd been expecting this summons, and at Wolfe's nod, he opened the door to the south room. Marcus Webb entered first, pale but determined, clutching a manila envelope with hands that shook slightly. Behind him came Lila Safford, moving with the mechanical precision of someone who'd finally accepted the inevitable. The room erupted. Charles cried out, "Marcus, what are you doing here?" Mrs. Whitmore stared at Lila with the expression of someone who'd just discovered a viper in her jewelry box. Montalvo sprang to his feet, pointing at Webb with theatrical indignation. "That man is a liar. He was bribed to disappear." "Sit down, Mr. Montalvo," Wolfe commanded, his voice cutting through the din like a blade through silk. Mr. Webb was indeed bribed by Miss Safford, acting to ensure his silence about what he witnessed in Mr. Thorne's workshop. Webb found his voice, though it carried the hollow quality of someone who'd spent days wrestling with his conscience and finally chosen the right side. "I saw her make the switch," he said, looking directly at Mrs. Whitmore. "Miss Safford asked to examine the ring, said she wanted to appreciate the craftsmanship. She had it for maybe 2 minutes, but when she handed it back, everything was different. The weight, the light, the way it felt. I tried to tell Mr. Thorne, but he wouldn't listen. Thorne, his face ashen, finally spoke. I was afraid. The Whitmores are powerful clients. When Miss Safford suggested that Marcus might be mistaken, that the workshop lighting could play tricks, I wanted to believe her." He looked at Webb with genuine remorse. "Marcus, I'm sorry. I should have listened to you." The conspiracy-unraveled Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. Mr. Thorne's fear, while regrettable, is understandable. Miss Safford, however, operated with considerably more calculation. When Miss Pembroke refused Mr. Whitmore's proposal and returned the ring, Miss Safford faced a crisis. Her plan had depended upon the ring remaining in the family, never subjected to expert examination. His gaze fixed on Lila Safford, who stood perfectly still beside Webb, her gray eyes reflecting nothing but resignation. Rather than abandon her scheme, Miss Safford chose to make Miss Pembroke the instrument of her success. If Elena Pembroke could be portrayed as a thief who had stolen the original diamond and returned a clever fake, the insurance claim would proceed and the family would be seen as victims rather than desperate aristocrats selling their heritage. Vincent Montalvo had been silent throughout the presentation, but now he leaned forward with the practiced charm of a man accustomed to talking his way out of difficult situations. "Mr. Wolfe, these are serious accusations. I hope you have more than the testimony of a frightened employee." "Mr. Montalvo, I have Miss Safford's complete confession, Mr. Webb's eyewitness testimony, physical evidence connecting you to both the insurance fraud and the harassment of Miss Pembroke, and documentation of your 30% fee for expediting fraudulent claims." Wolfe's smile was thin and predatory. "Your methods, the false safe deposit box entry, the selective leaks to the press, the manufactured evidence of Miss Pembroke's supposed guilt, are all documented in Miss Safford's meticulous records. The final revelation, the office fell silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on Wolfe's desk." Mrs. Whitmore looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Charles stared at Lila with the expression of someone who just realized his entire world had been built on quicksand. "The question before us," Wolfe continued, "is not whether this fraud occurred. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is how justice will be served." He paused, reaching into his desk drawer to withdraw a familiar jewelry box. When he opened it, the pink diamond caught the office light and threw it back in brilliant flashes that seemed to illuminate not just the room, but the moral complexity of everything that had transpired. The original diamond never left this office. Miss Safford brought it here yesterday morning, hidden in a concealed compartment of her briefcase. She intended to plant it among Miss Pembroke's possessions to complete the frame, but she underestimated both my powers of observation and my commitment to justice. Mrs. Whitmore's composure finally cracked completely. She stared at the diamond, her family's heritage, her salvation, her downfall, and began to weep quietly into her handkerchief. The moral reckoning. Lila Safford, who had been listening to Wolfe's methodical deconstruction of her actions in perfect silence, finally broke. They were going to lose everything, she said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and defeat. Everything they'd worked for, everything their name stood for. I couldn't let that happen. Not when there was a way to save them. And you decided to save their name by destroying another's, Wolfe concluded, his eyes boring into her. A rather cynical exchange, wouldn't you say, Miss Safford? You were prepared to sacrifice Miss Pembroke's honor, her reputation, her freedom, to preserve the illusion of Whitmore respectability. Before anyone could respond, the doorbell rang with the kind of authoritative persistence that meant official business. Fritz appeared in the doorway with Inspector Kramer and Sergeant Stebbins, both wearing the expressions of men who'd been expecting this call. "Inspector," Wolfe said without rising, "you arrive at precisely the right moment. Miss Safford and Mr. Montalvo are prepared to surrender themselves on charges of grand larceny, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence is comprehensive, the confessions are complete, and the stolen property has been recovered." The gathering was complete, the truth revealed, and justice positioned to strike with the precision of a master craftsman's final blow. All that remained was to determine who would stand and who would fall when the reckoning finally came. But that, as Wolfe would say, was a matter for the courts. His job, our job, was simply to ensure that truth emerged from the wreckage of human ambition and desperation, no matter how elegantly that wreckage had been disguised. If you want to understand the difference between ordinary police work and intellectual demolition, watch Nero Wolfe dismantle a criminal conspiracy using nothing more than logic, perfect grammar, and the kind of methodical precision that makes chess masters weep with envy. The office had become a courtroom where Wolfe served as judge, jury, and the kind of prosecuting attorney who never needed to raise his voice because truth was doing all the heavy lifting. Inspector Kramer stood near the door with Sergeant Stebbins, both wearing the expressions of men who'd arrived expecting routine police work and found themselves witnessing something considerably more sophisticated. Vincent Montalvo had gone very still in his chair, his expensive confidence replaced by the careful wariness of a predator who'd suddenly realized the food chain had been rearranged. The systematic destruction. "Inspector Kramer," Wolfe began without preamble, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone delivering a final judgment. "You arrive at the culmination of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Before you remove the guilty parties, they will understand exactly how their deception was constructed and why it was doomed to failure from its conception." He settled back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, and began the kind of methodical dissection that had made his reputation. First, the foundation. 18 months ago, the Whitmore family faced complete financial collapse. Medical expenses exceeding $300,000 annually. Failed investments totaling nearly $2 million in losses, and dwindling assets had reduced them from wealth to genteel poverty with approximately 4 months before bankruptcy. Mrs. Whitmore's spine stiffened, but she didn't interrupt. The truth, apparently, was more devastating when spoken aloud than when whispered in private consultations with accountants. Second, the solution. Miss Lila Safford, who managed the family's financial affairs and was therefore intimately familiar with their desperate circumstances, identified their only remaining asset of significant value, a 12-carat pink diamond, insured for $2 million, but impossible to sell without public acknowledgement of their ruin. Wolfe's gaze moved to Lila Safford, who stood beside Marcus Webb with the hollow composure of someone who'd finally stopped running from consequences. Third, the substitution. 6 months ago, Miss Safford commissioned an 8-carat sapphire replica of exceptional quality. The work cost $15,000. Money skimmed from household accounts over 6 months. When Mr. Charles Whitmore decided to propose to Miss Pembroke, Miss Safford suggested the ring be cleaned and inspected. During that cleaning at Thorne & Sons, she executed the substitution with the precision of someone who had studied jewelry techniques specifically for this purpose. Marcus Webb found his voice, though it carried the hollow quality of someone who'd spent days wrestling with conscience and finally chosen the right side. "I saw her make the switch," he said, looking directly at Mrs. Whitmore. Miss Safford asked to examine the ring, said she wanted to appreciate the craftsmanship. She had it for maybe 2 minutes, but when she handed it back, everything was different. The weight, the light reflection, the way it felt in my hands. The paprika revelation. Fourth, the trespass. Wolfe's voice cooled several degrees, and I recognized the tone he reserved for personal affronts. When Miss Pembroke's refusal to marry disrupted the plan, Miss Safford chose escalation over abandonment. Her midnight violation of my kitchen was not merely intimidation. It was reconnaissance for planting the original diamond among Miss Pembroke's possessions, thereby completing the frame. He gestured toward the small jar on his desk. The replacement of Fritz's Hungarian paprika with an inferior substitute was both taunt and warning, but it was also evidence. Someone with jeweler's polishing compound on their fingers had sampled my defenses, leaving traces of sapphire dust and scratches on locks. Childish in execution, but instructive in its revelation of desperation. Fritz appeared in the doorway, with the silent efficiency of a man who'd been expecting this vindication, his expression suggesting that crimes against his kitchen were finally receiving appropriate justice. The insurance conspiracy. Fifth, the professional accomplice. Wolfe's attention shifted to Vincent Montalvo, who was studying his manicured fingernails with the kind of intense concentration that suggested he was trying to become invisible through pure force of will. Mr. Montalvo's role was to provide legitimacy to the fraud through his expertise in insurance investigation. For 30% of the $2 million payout, he agreed to expedite the claim and ensure the investigation reached predetermined conclusions. I consulted my notebook and continued the narrative. The manufactured evidence was Montalvo's specialty. The false safe deposit box entry at Elena Pembroke's bank, the selective leaks, to the press, the suggestion that she had attempted to hide the real diamond. All professional touches designed to build an unshakable case. Sergeant Stebbins looked up from his notes. "We pulled those bank records this afternoon. Perfect match for Mr. Montalvo's handwriting samples on the visitor log, and the security cameras caught him impersonating Miss Pembroke's assistant." Montalvo finally attempted his practiced charm. "Mr. Wolfe, you're painting in broad strokes. Insurance requires documentation." "Mr. Montalvo," Wolfe interrupted with surgical precision, "your documentation consists of forgeries, perjured statements, and manufactured evidence. Mr. Goodwin obtained bank camera footage showing your agent, a woman with priors in Queens for perjury, making the false deposit entry. Your phone logs show calls to press contacts at 5:42 this morning, and your surveillance team outside my house represents criminal intimidation of witnesses." The moral reckoning. The office fell silent except for the soft ticking of Wolfe's desk clock. Charles Whitmore looked like a man who'd finally understood that consequences weren't just theoretical concepts, but actual forces that could reshape lives in ways he'd never imagined. "The question before us," Wolfe continued, "is not whether this fraud occurred. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is how justice will be served, and what lessons will be learned from this exercise in misguided loyalty and criminal ambition." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew the familiar jewelry box. When he opened it, the pink diamond caught the office light and threw it back in brilliant flashes that seemed to illuminate not just the room, but the moral complexity of everything that had transpired. The original diamond never left this office. Miss Safford brought it here yesterday morning, concealed in her briefcase, intending to plant it among Miss Pembroke's possessions after securing either my compliance or my intimidation. When she realized neither would be forthcoming, she chose cooperation and surrendered both the diamond and her confession. Lila Safford, who had been listening to Wolfe's methodical deconstruction in perfect silence, finally broke. They were going to lose everything, she said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and defeat. Everything they'd worked for, everything their name stood for. I couldn't let that happen, not when there was a way to save them. Miss Safford, Wolfe replied, his eyes boring into her with unforgiving clarity. You elected to save a name by destroying a life. You were prepared to sacrifice Elena Pembroke's honor, her reputation, her freedom, to preserve the illusion of Whitmore respectability. That is not loyalty. It is moral cowardice disguised as devotion. Justice delivered. Inspector Kramer stepped forward, his handcuffs already in hand. Miss Safford, Mr. Montalvo, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, grand larceny, criminal impersonation, and witness intimidation. You have the right to remain silent. As Kramer recited the familiar Miranda warnings, I watched the faces around the room. Mrs. Whitmore sat with the rigid composure of someone who just watched her world collapse and was trying to decide whether to mourn or rebuild. Charles looked like he'd finally understood that adult life involved consequences that couldn't be avoided through charm or family connections. Quentin Thorne was visibly relieved. The weight of guilty knowledge finally lifted from his shoulders. Inspector, he said, I'll provide a written statement of my error and submit to review by the Jewelers Association. Marcus, if you'll return to the trade, I'll recommend you personally. Marcus Webb nodded, standing straighter than he had since entering the office. The burden of silence had been replaced by the satisfaction of having chosen truth over convenience. The aftermath. After Kramer had led the guilty parties away, Wolfe turned his attention to the Whitmores, who remained in their chairs like survivors of a natural disaster trying to assess the damage. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, offering her the jewelry box, this ring belongs to your family. However, its insurance value cannot be claimed through fraudulent means. You will need to make difficult decisions about your financial future, but you will make them honestly. Mrs. Whitmore accepted the box with trembling hands. Mr. Wolfe, I want you to know that I had no knowledge of Lila's plan. If I had suspected, Madam, your ignorance of the details does not absolve you of responsibility for creating the circumstances that made such a plan seem necessary to your employ. Pride and financial recklessness are not crimes, but they are not virtues either. Charles cleared his throat nervously. What happens now? Now, Mr. Whitmore, you will contact Eleanor Pembroke and offer a complete and public apology. You will cooperate fully with the authorities, and you will learn to live within your means, regardless of how that might affect your social standing. Final reflections. After the Whitmores had departed with their recovered heirloom and their damaged dignity, I found Wolfe in his chair with a glass of beer, staring thoughtfully at the empty space where the jewelry box had been. Satisfying conclusion? I asked. Justice has been served, he replied, though not without cost. Miss Safford's talents were considerable. In different circumstances, she might have been a formidable ally rather than a dangerous adversary. But she made the fundamental error of assuming the right to determine whose reputation deserved protection and whose could be sacrificed for convenience. And Elena Pembroke. Wolfe's smile was thin but genuine. Miss Pembroke will emerge from this affair with her reputation not just intact, but enhanced. She has been revealed as a woman of sufficient character to refuse an advantageous marriage, and sufficient courage to demand justice when falsely accused. Such qualities are rarer than 12-carat pink diamonds. He reached for his beer, and I recognized the expression of deep satisfaction that meant a case had been not just solved, but properly concluded. "Archie," he said, "you will call Miss Pembroke and inform her that the calumny will be repudiated in tomorrow's editions, and that she is welcome to visit at 11 to collect her apology." "Notarized?" I asked. "Printed and signed. Notarization implies mistrust. We will have honesty, or we will have nothing." Fritz appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man whose world had been restored to proper order. "Dinner in 20 minutes, Mr. Wolfe. The paprika has been replaced with the genuine article." "Excellent, Fritz. And tonight we dine with the satisfaction of knowing that substitution, however adroit, always leaves a seam in spices, in stones, in souls." The reveal was complete. Justice had been served, and the brownstone was returning to its natural state of ordered tranquility. In Nero Wolfe's universe, that constituted not just success, but the proper functioning of moral law. The case was closed, the bill would be paid, and tomorrow would bring new problems requiring the same methodical application of intelligence to the eternal human capacity for self-deception. For a Thursday evening, that was a very full program indeed. Friday morning brought the kind of crisp October sunlight that makes even Manhattan look like it might have been designed by someone with an appreciation for beauty. And I woke to the sound of Fritz humming in the kitchen, always a reliable indicator that the universe had been restored to its proper configuration. When Fritz hums while preparing breakfast, it means the paprika is genuine, the coffee is perfect, and no criminals have violated his sacred domain in the past 24 hours. The morning papers, by the time I made it to the office with my coffee and the morning papers, Wolfe was already settled behind his desk with a glass of milk in the Times, wearing the expression of deep satisfaction that comes from watching justice unfold with the precision of a well-orchestrated symphony. The headlines told the story in the kind of stark language that newspaper editors reserve for scandals involving society figures and large sums of money. Heiress cleared in diamond scandal dominated the front page of the Times, with a smaller headline reading, "Insurance fraud ring exposed by private detective." The Post had gone with their usual restraint. Socialite secretary's $1 million con game, accompanied by photographs of Lila Safford and Vincent Montalvo being led away in handcuffs. But it was Lon Cohen's piece in the Gazette that captured the moral complexity of the affair with the kind of nuanced reporting that makes you remember why good journalism matters. His article detailed not just the mechanics of the fraud, but the human cost. Elena Pembroke's reputation nearly destroyed. Marcus Webb's conscience wrestled into cooperation through financial desperation, and the Whitmore family's pride leading them into circumstances where theft seemed preferable to honest acknowledgement of their difficulties. "Satisfying coverage," I observed, spreading the papers across Wolfe's desk. "Mr. Cohen understands that criminal cases involve more than mere legal violations," Wolfe replied, not looking up from the Times. "They involve the eternal human capacity for self-deception, the dangerous intersection of desperation and opportunity, and the moral courage required to choose truth over convenience." Elena's vindication. At 11 o'clock sharp, Fritz announced Elena Pembroke's arrival, and I went to the door to find her looking like a woman who'd spent the night rediscovering what it felt like to breathe freely. The wariness that had marked our first meeting was gone, replaced by the kind of composed confidence that comes from surviving a sophisticated attack on your character and emerging with your integrity not just intact, but proven. "Mr. Goodwin," she said as I led her to the office, "I owe you and Mr. Wolfe a debt that can't be measured in mere money." "The satisfaction of seeing justice done is payment enough," Wolfe replied from behind his desk, though he gestured toward the red leather chair with something that might have been warmth in a less controlled man. "Though I trust your reputation will recover completely from this unfortunate affair." Eleanor settled into the chair with the grace of someone who no longer had to worry about hidden traps or ulterior motives. The phone started ringing at 6 this morning, board members offering apologies, donors expressing support, colleagues asking how they can help repair any damage. It seems that surviving a sophisticated frame job has enhanced rather than diminished my standing in the community. She reached into her purse and withdrew a check, which she placed on Wolfe's desk with the deliberate precision of someone completing a sacred transaction. Your fee, with a bonus for excellence and a personal note of gratitude that no amount of money could adequately express. I've also established a scholarship fund for young people studying jewelry arts, to be administered in memory of those who choose integrity over convenience. Wolfe examined the check briefly, then filed it in his desk drawer with the casual efficiency of someone for whom money was merely a necessary tool. Miss Pembroke, you have provided me with something more valuable than monetary compensation. You have demonstrated that there are still people in this world who will demand justice regardless of the personal cost. The Whitmore reckoning. Before Eleanor could respond, Fritz appeared in the doorway with the announcement that Charles Whitmore was requesting an audience. I went to collect him, finding him standing in the hall with the posture of a man who'd spent the night learning difficult lessons about adult responsibility. "Mr. Wolfe," he said when I'd led him to the office, "I've come to apologize to Miss Pembroke and to thank you for preventing me from becoming an unwitting accomplice to a serious crime." He handed Elena a thick white envelope with the expensive watermark, doing penance by association. "Miss Pembroke, I behaved shamefully. I did not know, which is not a defense. I did not look, which is worse. I'm sorry." The letter contained signatures from Charles, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, and Avery Kerr, with phrases about retraction and restitution and an unconditional acknowledgement of her integrity. Elena read it once, folded it, and tucked it into her bag. "Thank you. You'll send copies to the papers?" "They already have them, and to the boards." Charles's voice carried the kind of humility that suggested recent acquaintance with harsh realities. "We're selling the Southampton house, the boat, and the Lake Placid place. Mother is scaling back her medical treatments to those covered by standard insurance. I'm liquidating my investment portfolio to cover our debts, regardless of the losses involved." Wolfe studied Charles with the attention of someone cataloguing the effects of moral education. A name is a millstone when affixed to an empty stomach. Loose ends secured. After Charles had departed with his dignity somewhat restored and his illusions permanently shattered, the phone brought updates from various quarters. Inspector Kramer reported that both Lila Safford and Vincent Montalvo had been formally charged and were being held without bail pending trial. Marcus Webb had been cleared of all suspicion and offered his old position back at Thorne & Sons, with a raise and a formal commendation for his integrity under pressure. Quentin Thorne called personally, his voice steadier than it had been in days. "Mr. Wolfe, my statement goes to the Jewelers Association this afternoon. I've offered Webb a bench and tuition for certification if he'll accept. I don't intend to be remembered as the man who blinked." "Then don't blink again," Wolfe said, and rang off. The insurance company had issued a statement acknowledging the fraudulent claim and praising the thorough investigation that had prevented a significant loss. The Times was planning a follow-up piece about the growing problem of insurance fraud in high-value personal property cases. The philosophical reflection. As Fritz served lunch, cold salmon with dill sauce, prepared with the kind of meticulous attention that suggested he was celebrating more than just the restoration of his paprika supply, Wolfe offered his analysis of the case's deeper meanings. "Archie, this affair has illustrated a fundamental truth about criminal behavior. Miss Safford's plan failed not because of any technical flaw in its execution, but because it was based on a false premise about human nature. She assumed that Miss Pembroke would accept disgrace quietly rather than fight for justice, and she assumed that we would be intimidated by midnight trespass rather than motivated by it. She underestimated everyone involved. She underestimated the power of truth to assert itself, despite sophisticated efforts to suppress it. Miss Safford was intelligent, thorough, and professionally competent. But she lacked the moral imagination to understand that some people will demand justice regardless of the personal cost. The dinner ritual. Fritz served dinner at 7:30, roast pheasant with wild mushroom reduction, prepared with the kind of reverent attention that suggested he was still celebrating his victory over the forces of culinary chaos. The aroma that had been building all afternoon now filled the dining room with the complex, earthy fragrance of perfectly prepared fowl, enhanced by the authentic Szeged paprika. As we ate, Wolfe offered his final observation on the case. "Archie, Miss Safford's greatest error was not technical but philosophical. She believed that loyalty to employers justified betrayal of strangers, that preserving one reputation warranted destroying another, that the end of financial salvation justified the means of criminal deception. Such thinking always contains the seeds of its own destruction. Because truth has a way of asserting itself? Because justice, like Fritz's paprika, cannot be successfully counterfeited indefinitely. Sooner or later, someone with sufficient knowledge and moral courage will detect the substitution and demand the genuine article." The heavy oak door had closed on the last of our official visitors, sealing off the vestiges of drama and leaving the brownstone to settle into its familiar rhythm. The air, no longer charged with tension, carried only the subtle scents of leather, old paper, and the earthy aroma of orchids from the plant rooms above. The return to order. Fritz appeared with coffee in the afternoon mail, among which was a formal thank-you note from Elena Pembroke, written on heavy paper with elegant penmanship. She wrote that the scholarship fund would likely have Marcus Webb as its first beneficiary, and properly so. Miss Pembroke understands that justice requires not just punishment of the guilty, but support for those who choose virtue despite personal cost, Wolfe observed. As the afternoon settled into comfortable routine, I reflected on the strange alchemy that transforms criminal cases into moral education. Lila Safford had tried to destroy Elena Pembroke's reputation to save the Whitmore family's pride, and instead had taught everyone involved valuable lessons about the cost of deception and the power of truth. The pink diamond was back with its rightful owners, who would probably have to sell it honestly to survive their financial crisis. Elena Pembroke's reputation was stronger than ever. Marcus Webb had learned that moral courage, while initially expensive, ultimately pays the best dividends, and Fritz had upgraded his security systems to ensure that no future criminals would dare violate his kitchen. At 4 o'clock, Wolfe departed for his daily appointment with the orchids, leaving me to handle the afternoon mail and contemplate the satisfying conclusion of a case that had combined sophisticated criminality with fundamental questions about loyalty, justice, and the price of maintaining appearances. Evening's end, I raised my wine glass as Fritz cleared the dessert plates. To genuine articles, then, in spices, in stones, and in souls. Wolfe's smile was thin but genuine. "Indeed, Archie, and to the satisfaction of knowing that in this particular instance, all three have been properly authenticated and restored to their rightful places. The case of the heiress who refused the ring was closed, the bill had been paid, and the brownstone had returned to its natural state of ordered tranquility. Tomorrow would bring new problems requiring the same methodical application of intelligence to the eternal human capacity for self-deception. But that, as Wolfe would say, was tomorrow's concern. Tonight, we dined with the satisfaction of having served justice, protected the innocent, and proven once again that truth, however temporarily obscured, eventually finds a way to shine through the most sophisticated deceptions. The brownstone slept the sleep of a house that had been trespassed upon and had survived, its jars in order and its bolts secure. Outside, New York rehearsed tomorrow's scandals. Inside, justice had kept its appointment, eaten its dinner, and left a tip. In our business, that's as tidy as it gets.